Hello, Pod. How are you?
Mr. Lawrence, good to see you.
Well, thank you for agreeing to participate in this conversation.
Happy to. Always good to chat.
Lovely. Well, you know all about TLIM, and you know that we essentially what we're doing is helping people create their own approach to team coaching through the three Ps. What's your philosophy? What underpins the work that you do? Why do you do the work? And and what do you actually do? What would you see you doing if we were following you around? And on the program, I was very much struck by your three practice principles. And so I thought, yeah, it'd be good to ask you more about those, the practice principles, and also just explore where they've come from. How come they are your practice principles?
Right.
Lovely. So do you want you've got three of them. Do you want to just take us through them?
Yeah, look, and I mean, the first thing I would say is it was great to be on the program with you for a range of reasons. You and I have worked together for a long time. We've done a lot of team stuff together. We've done research together. We've sat in the South Coast, the New South Wales, reading academic papers together. So, but to be in your program with you and to see what you've done on the TLIM program, which I think is a great distillation of a whole lot of learning, distilled into a very accessible. I found it great because it forced me to actually think through some things that were, unconsciously competent, but I hadn't actually thought about it. So thank you for the opportunity to think that through, including this notion of some of my practice principles that were probably innately obvious to other people who work with me, but I hadn't purposely thought them through. So it was a good opportunity just to think about it. And when you forced me to think about it and talk about it to the group we were in, it actually made perfect sense to me as to why they've become my principles in hindsight, right?
Mm.
So it was useful. So the way I articulated it on the evening that we had the conversation was the first one is the hard work is done before you enter the room.
Mhm.
And this is very much influenced by Peter Hawkins from the UK, who you and I both know. I had the pleasure of working with Peter for a couple of years, almost 20 years ago. And Peter's a very valued mentor of mine. And that was a phrase he said to me once. And he talked about the notion of great team coaching involves getting the team into a place or a readiness to do the work before they actually come into the room. And how do you spend time working with them in almost a pre-contracting and contracting manner, but also an information gathering manner, an agenda co-creating manner. And what I've realized since, what I do is a nudging and shifting their energy and mindset manner before they walk into the room, so that when you on almost the first hour, they're ready to go. So you're not waiting for half a day for people to
Mm.
warm up. They're ready to go.
Mm.
Um, so in a very practical sense, what does that mean for me? There's all the obvious stuff about interviewing people, getting the agenda ready, getting a sense of the organization. So I do a lot of work with leadership teams. That's my space. So I only work with leadership teams. So when I talk about teamwork, that's the context that I talk about. It's specifically leadership teams. Usually it's the most senior leadership team of an organization, or it's the most senior leadership team in an affiliate, like a multinational organization, so a country leadership team of a multinational. So quite a senior group.
Mm.
So therefore, interviewing all the members of the team, there's obviously a reason to be working with them, which is typically I'm working with the most senior leader already. There's an agenda creation process. So that's all the obvious stuff that anybody would be doing. But the practice principle for me is using questions such as, and I ask this of everybody, ask them about the business, the landscape of the business, the competitive context they're in, where the business is situated. And there's some specific questions I'll ask. What's the biggest shift the business needs to make in order to be successful? What's the biggest shift the leadership team needs to make in order to help the business be successful? And then the third question is, what's the biggest shift you as a leader have to make in order for the team that you're a part of to be successful? Now, what's interesting about that question is the more aware leaders of the team will go, oh, that's an interesting question. they'll pause and they'll go, probably blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
Half the team members will go, oh, I've never thought about that. And my response will be, can I get you to think about it before we come together on next day? Because it's really important that you have a think about that.
Mm.
And so when you think about the hard work being done, I have them thinking along some things before they come into the room. And depending on the agenda, I will ask people to do some pre-work, which invariably is pre-thinking of specific questions before they come into the room. So therefore, the notion of the hard work is done. And what I mean by that is I've nudged them into a space where they're ready to have conversations or tackle specific questions in the first hour. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
And I found that to be a very, very useful piece over time.
Yeah. Lovely.
And the second one, which I think our reference says, not every nail needs a hammer.
Mm.
I think that comes back to, and every coach and every consultant learns some specific tools and techniques early in their career, and they love them and they embrace them. And irrespective of the issue, they take out that technique and apply it. And sometimes that's useful, sometimes it's not. I am very influenced by the art sector. I grew up as a musician, and I learn a lot from watching musicians and from watching theatre and watching movies. So that's the space that I learn a lot from. And what I've realized over the years is great artists who put on an overall experience. The greatest artists are not necessarily the people who are technically the best musicians. My favorite band, who I know, Paul, I know you love this band. You and I discussed this at length. U2, they're not the technically best band in the world by any means. I mean, arguably, Edge is a great guitar player, but the band as musicians are not the best musicians in the world. But they put on a great experience because they have got really good at many, many things. And I think it's great team coaches that I've watched over the years. They learn a range of skills that brings together the overall experience. So they learn how to use rooms, physical spaces. They learn how to use flip charts and thick markers as a simple example. They learn how to use somatic exercises or narrative exercises or drama exercises or a whole range of different things. So that when an issue arises in the conversation, they're not stuck. Right? Or if they're applying a particular technique and it's not working, they can pivot very, very quickly to something else.
Mm.
Why do I believe that works? I've been doing this job for 20 years, and every single day, after every single session, I ask the same question of the group: what was most useful for all of you in the room today?
Mm.
Every time I ask that question, same answers apply, which is at least one person in the room feeds back to me the thing that I would have found most useful had I been in the room. But at least half the room feed back to me stuff that I personally would not have found useful at all, but they found very, very useful, right?
Mm.
Which means a range of different things are very, very important.
Mm.
And the more I've learned, like as in the wider my skills and more eclectic my skills, the better the experience I have found over time. And
Yeah, because that's interesting. Because when I first read that, and when I first heard you talking about it, my mind went actually to theories and frameworks. Because I know a lot of team people who initially come into team coaching have been very focused on team dynamics, and that's what they've done with the team. Or they've been very focused on let's get your vision and your objectives clear, and they do that no matter what. As opposed, and so my initial interpretation of what you were saying was coming from a kind of models frameworks perspective.
I think that is also true. That's also
Mm.
true. It is. I certainly believe. I believe most frameworks are useful, but all are flawed. Like
Mm.
every single framework I've ever used is flawed. So therefore, to be hanging on to God, this framework is the panacea for your issues is completely naive.
Mm.
Some frameworks are useful very often, but certainly not always.
Mm.
So I have found building a range of frameworks, like even the notion of vision setting as a team, having a range of frameworks to do that alone is useful.
Mm.
But sticking to one or two frameworks is completely naive. But
Mhm.
it's perfectly right at a particular stage of your career. If you're early in your career, by nature, you're going to be building up frameworks.
Mm.
But I think to be great at team
Mm.
coaching, you have to build up the foundational frameworks. That's the core skill. But then I think there's a wider piece of what's the experience that people will have beyond the actual
Mm.
frameworks and the coaching part that makes. I've had 2 or 3 days with Paul Lawrence, and I walked away going, that was a great experience. It wasn't the framework they remember. It was a
Mm.
wider piece they remember.
Mm. Yeah, lovely. All right.
And the third one, I must say, it took me quite a while in my career to come to this.
Mm.
And this is the idea of less is more.
Mm.
I've been accused far too often of being over generous, and that's a lovely way of saying I've stuffing too much into the agenda, right?
Mm.
Yeah, over generous. Of course, we can get through all of these. Of course, we will.
Mm.
And invariably, that means that 20-minute break we have on the agenda is now down to 5 minutes because we got to get through more stuff, and that's not helpful.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
there are some team sessions that it's really useful for team coaches to be there to do like process facilitation to help the team get through
Mm.
logistics, information sharing, clarifying of questions, clarifying roles and responsibilities, that kind of stuff. And that's useful. And therefore, it's more of a cognitive kind of conversation. You can get through a lot of stuff on that kind of an agenda. And that's useful. There's a place for that. It's not deep work. It's not developmental work. It's not learning work, but it's certainly an important stage of a team coming together,
Mm.
very much an alignment type process. And without that, teams rarely get into high performance. So it's an important stage. And you can have a lot of stuff on that kind of an agenda. But if you want to move into any kind of high team learning or team dynamics or post-event analysis type stuff, the less you have on the agenda, the better, because it allows space for
Mm.
conversation, allows
Mm.
space for people to go, can I be brave and say X? And
Mm.
where I really learned this was actually during COVID,
Mhm.
uh, late 20, maybe first half of 2021. The leadership teams that allowed me and our team to spend time with them to help them review the way they had led in the first half of the pandemic. And our process was really, really simple. It would be as simple as on a scale of 1 to 10, looking back over the last 6 months, how have you guys gone? Have a conversation. They'd come up with a conversation, they'd come up with a number. Our next piece was, why did you pick that number? Why did you not pick 5 out of 10? Why did you not pick 9 out of 10? Have that conversation. And then the last piece was, if the pandemic keeps going, what needs to happen to get to 9 out of 10?
Mm.
Teams that had that conversation over the course of half a day or a day, which is a long conversation, think about how simple it was. In the second half of 2022, when the lockdowns continued, they thrived because they were in a great reflective space. They had done the learning, whereas the teams that didn't have that conversation or just crammed it
Mm.
in because they wanted to get on to other stuff, they struggled.
Mm.
And it really reinforced to me for deep reflection, for learning, for bravery, for any kind of let's address the elephants in the room or the tough topics, or let's address where we as a team are falling down and it's embarrassing or we feel ashamed or whatever the associated
Mm.
emotion is, or we're even confused as to why we are. Let's allow space for that. Less is more, and
Yeah.
that's where the learning occurs.
So if I had three practice principles, less is more definitely resonates, but I'm not sure I always quite manage to stick to it. And it reminds me of the program, and some of the folks who've done sessions on the TLIM program have been very busy. So I'm curious as to how you manage it, because it feels like the right principle to make that time for reflection and so on. But when you're dealing with it, because you're not dealing with an individual, obviously you're dealing with a team, and you'll occasionally you quite often get some folks who are just in a hurry, and will start looking at the phone or just not engaging. How do you manage that in practice?
Um, where I've landed actually is how I write up the agenda.
Hmm.
I set up my agenda not in terms of hour slots or minutes or line items. I set up my agenda with, here's the question that we need to answer.
Hmm.
And therefore becomes, today we have 3 questions.
Mm.
and two of them are set up before lunch, and one of them is set up after lunch.
Hmm.
And there's obviously an introduction and there's a wrap up type piece, but that's how I set up the agenda. So
Mm.
people don't actually know how long in my mind, I've allocated for those sessions, other than we're here to address three key things. Now,
Mm.
in my mind, I actually have allocated a process and a time, etc.
Mm.
I've allocated a buffer, and I typically have allocated, if this takes longer, then I'll take that away from this. Like
Mm.
I
Mm.
have that a plan B in my own mind. But in terms of what the team sees, they go, okay, we're here to address these key areas, whatever those key areas are.
Mm.
And I find that, as simple as it is, that takes away the notion of we need to keep the time, or we're not on time, or we're spending too little time on this, or we're getting too little done.
Mm.
Because all they're aware of is progress means we've addressed question one, now we're moving on to question two.
Mm. Mm. And I'm just sensing perhaps another aspect to your practice model, which is because you talked about before lunch and after lunch, so the implication being, and I may be wrong, but when you work with a team, you're working with a team perhaps for a day, and you can correct me if that's wrong, but this emphasis on reflection and meaning making, and so I'm curious about where that's come from for you, as it comes back to your less is more piece and that value of reflection piece, and where in your kind of experience or learnings, or where's that emerged for, or how has that emerged for you as an important part of the work, the way you do the work?
Yeah. So I rarely work with a team for less than 2 days.
Hmm.
So typically it's 2 days or more. For at least the first and second time I work with a team.
Hmm.
If there's a third or fourth time I work with a team, then a day often is fine because we've built up a whole rhythm, and we all know each other, and that's fine. But I find for at least the two first events where I'm working with a team, um, and by the way, I should say, I typically work with a team because I've already started working with the leader of the team,
Yeah.
and or kicking off the team session means I'm also kicking off working with the team leader. So there is a parallel piece that runs with that. I would say 9 times out of 10. So that helps get a rhythm in place for the future. But certainly the first and second time I'm working with a team, it's at least 2 days.
Mm.
What I have found, and I try to bring this into practice as much as I can, try to have an overnight dinner between day one and day two. At that dinner, try to have some degree of personal sharing process happen over dinner in a fun way. So it could be
Mm.
as simple as, and this is part of the pre-work, the way I often say to people, bring an artifact or a memento or something about yourself that no one else in your team knows about you. So you can just share as a story over dinner.
Mm.
And invariably that sparks a degree of curiosity and anxiety for some people. But invariably, like I think I've been doing this now for 20 years. I've had one person ever refuse to do that in 20 years, and that person left the team a week later. So there was something else going on for that person. But in the 20 years, that process has sparked a ferocious amount of insight into each other. I had one team once in the insurance industry, and that the age difference of the team was about 20 years. And three members of the team brought in their Kangaroos jersey, as in they played
Yeah.
rugby league for Australia, and the other two folks were not aware of that.
Yeah.
Right? So the shared history they weren't even aware they had was phenomenal. So that storytelling over dinner allows any kind of deep questioning to happen on day two to
Mm.
accelerate quicker. So I tend to do in that kind of a process, tend to do any kind of cognitive, logistical, that kind of strategy type work on day one, shared stuff over dinner, and then any kind of deeper transparency, skill, not so much skill building, but trust building, or just the expanding the relationship. Keep that on the day two, but use the bridge overnight for that.
Mm. Yeah, cool. And after those first couple of two, do you then sometimes work with the team for shorter periods of time, or do you prefer to stick to that fewer big chunks of time together?
Um, if I'm working with like typically when we're engaged to work with a leadership team, it's often for about a year.
Mm.
And so if there is a typical process, and I don't like off the shelf type processes because then by nature I'm not listening to the team. But if
Mm.
there is a typical process, it looks something like a kickoff meeting that's a 2-day meeting because there's a new CEO or the team is being formed or there's a reason for the team to come together and restart. So we'd often call it a restart meeting,
Mm.
which looks like alignment around what's this team here to do, what's the strategy, why are we here, just get clarity on roles and responsibilities, decision making processes, the way we're going to operate, that kind of very important clarifying stuff, very important roles and responsibility clarifying, not deep work, but very, very important alignment type work. And so that initial 2-day meeting often coincides with, say, it happens, say, 2 months after a new leader's been appointed to lead
Mhm.
the organization, that kind of meeting.
Yeah.
Um, Typically, then we would. I'm a big fan of the leadership circle as a 360 and a leadership framework. So we would typically run that process, say 3 to 6 months later,
Mhm.
and bring the team together after that whole team has had individual debriefs and has had say 2 or 3 sessions with myself and my colleagues. Bring the team together for 2 days, and that 2 days is built around using leadership circle framework as the core framework, but the 2 days is built around the way they lead as a collective group. So there'll be a fair bit of conversations around the framework itself, a fair bit of conversations around folks sharing how they learn to lead and therefore why their assessment shows up the way it shows up. But it's more about here's what I learned and why I learned it. We do a
Mhm.
deep dive into narrative identity, so a lot of personal sharing. And there's a process we build around that. So there's a whole storytelling process that I lead based upon my own narrative identity and my dad and the way he influenced me and then all that stuff around
Mm.
that allows those folks to then go away and tell their stories. Again, that's often an overnight, over dinner type piece, or else it's early in the morning of day two type piece. And then that leads us into a peer-to-peer sharing piece on, well, based on our strategy that we've already decided in the last couple of months, based on our conversations today on our leadership, what are we individually going to be trying to work on over the next 12 months? And
Mm.
then, therefore, what do my peers need from me? And that's a really web-based, I call it spider web building. We're bringing the peer-to-peer conversation together. So we buddy people up again and again and again. We help each other co-write the development plans. So each leader helps each other write the development plans. We do
Mm.
a lot of work on experiments. I'm a big believer on it's easy to go into a program and write your plan and everyone forgets the plan. It's so easy. Whereas if you think about, I'm actually going to experiment with these two things over the next couple of months, and that's all I'm going to do. And so we do a whole lot of stuff around just my experiments are this. Um, that becomes a 2-day program. And so we end up talking about what's the experiments on the habits I want to build and what the experiments are on my limitations I want to try and drop.
Mm.
And that becomes a 2-day conversation.
Mm.
And then probably between 3 and 6 months later, we bring the team back to review their progress, particularly the progress on that they're not making, because
Mm.
it's really easy to celebrate the stuff that everyone thinks, hey, fantastic. But let's be real on you were genuinely, or you said you were genuine 3 to 6 months ago, but actually no one's noticed anything. So let's just really figure out why that is.
Mm.
And the reality, of course, is leadership team members are very, very busy. And I find it's the third session in the leadership team process is where the teams suddenly click into going, okay, now we have to be serious. And that's where the development kicks in.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wouldn't happen if the first two hadn't happened in a similar way. It's my experience.
Yeah. Beautiful. So my last, well, you've talked about your practice principles and you've shared with us other aspects of your practice. My last question really, what are one or two, you've already shared some, but what are one or two really key experiences as your time as a very experienced team coach, which you think have informed your approach?
Um, so the notion of narrative, as in what's my
Mm.
story, understanding my story, understanding that Paul Byrne, one of my colleagues who's based out of Amsterdam, he talks about your narratives are almost the oldest part of your character, so
Mm.
embrace them.
Mm. Mm.
So understanding them and understanding that the ability to write a story going forward is actually very powerful if you
Mm.
understand the story that made you who you are today.
Mm.
Um, I found that a phenomenally liberating part of my own development and a phenomenally liberating part of most leaders' development that I've worked with.
Mm.
Um, Now, it takes a while to get into it. It takes a while, and that's why slowing down is a really important part of this process to take time to understand that.
Mm.
So the notion of how my story was written, what influenced my story, and how that
Mm.
impacts my leadership is a really crucial part of it. But a second, equally more important part is I have the authority and ability and the empowerment to write my own story going forward. How do I want to do that? That's an
Mm.
equally important part. So
Mm.
that's 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 very, very important.
And
Uh,
what would be what are your key narratives underpinning you as a team coach?
um, well, I suppose one of the evolving narratives, which is part of personal maturity and also experience, team coaching is, in my view, a very privileged position to be. Particularly when you work with leadership teams, you get, a ringside seat in really important, influential conversations, and in some cases with really, not some cases, in every case, really skilled, well-intentioned executives making really cool, doing cool things.
Mm.
And in many cases, you get to go to really cool parts of the world to do all that. So, it's a cool job, right? And it's very, very easy to get wrapped up in the ego of that. And there's certainly a part of my life when, I remember being picked up in black limousines on a regular basis, thinking, how cool am I? Right? Yeah, that's not very helpful, really, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so one of my evolving narratives has been, the notion of service and how can I be of service, and certainly noticing what color is the limousine or what floor of the hotel am I staying in isn't obvious, right? Whereas the notion of how often is my voice in the room versus actually how often my voice is not in the room, and actually my voice is more useful just to be nodding and nudging and prodding and just having quiet conversations in the corner with key people at different times is far more useful. That's been a very useful narrative over time.
Mm.
Sure.
Lovely. And what else because I interrupted you. What else were you going to say in terms of
And the second one for me, and this probably goes back to one of my early careers, was in corporate headhunting and talent management consulting, and strategy consulting. So I think of leadership through the lens of what is the organization trying to achieve, number one.
Mhm.
Number two, what is your role there to do? And then number three, how are you doing your role? That's how I think of leadership always.
Mhm.
And so therefore, interpersonal dynamics for me are a subset of that. So I think of coming down that way, whereas I think a lot of coaches think of interpersonal dynamics and work their way up in terms of
Mhm.
how. So I do
Mm.
the opposite. So for me, when I'm looking at a team that are struggling or whatever, I tend to go up and go, "Right, so where's the strategy? Where's the team sitting? Where's their roles? And therefore, are there issues around there that's causing some of the dynamic issues?" So, an example, a matrix structure is a great example of where dynamic issues can be at play. Because in a matrix structure, you have some people who are reporting to different parts of the organization, sometimes different parts of the world. And in some cases, have different strategic directions that are actually at conflict with each other. And therefore, the
Mm.
dynamics that are happening in the team are not because of the folks in the team, it's because there's two different strategic directions that they're being asked to do. So thinking at those levels I find to be very, very useful. And
Mm.
I found that approach allows me to partner with the CEO and leadership team quite nicely in the sense of helping them to figure out where they sit in an organization and what they're there to do. And sometimes allows me to partner with them to help them to let go of minutia very, very quickly and just to elevate the thinking in terms of, yes, this is interesting and yes, it's annoying, but really, it's not the most important thing. Let's get back here to where you're being paid to focus on.
Cool. Well, thank you, Pod. I think we talked about that being a 5-minute conversation around your 3 practice principles, but I haven't had the clock on it. I think that was a bit more than 5 minutes.
I told you put a boundary around it. We could go for hours.
That was a very rich conversation, and thank you ever so much.
You're welcome, man. Good to see you.
Thanks, Pod.